In this video, we're going to take a look at a lovely 2012 Ford Fiesta 1.25 gasoline. The problem is that it's not charging. The charging light comes on periodically, and sometimes the battery is dead. We've had it on the hotline with ElectroPartner, and we've decided to bring it in ourselves because it had some interesting faults that we want to dig deeper into. And we've definitely done that. What's a bit special about this one is that it's had a new alternator installed, an aftermarket alternator. Then it got a new battery, and then yet another new alternator, and it's also had a new engine control unit, plus a used original alternator. But still, we have the problem that it periodically doesn't charge. So let's take a closer look at what we found out about this car. When the case started on our hotline, the original fault codes were battery voltage, learned under the ABS control unit. We had a U0120 communication error in the engine control unit. We had a P065B. That was also a generator control performance fault code. P065C mechanical fault in the generator, also stored under the engine control unit. So those were the fault codes we found relevant based on the charging symptoms. The customer had his own PICO, and he had sent it in to our hotline, where they analyzed the LIN bus signal and could see from the serial decoding that it was the correct generator and the signal was correct. And we could also see that it matched the fault code for a mechanical fault in the generator. So we thought it was an interesting case to measure, since the serial decoding looked fine, but we still had this fault code. The worst thing about this fault was that it was really intermittent, so we could drive the car for 4 or 5 days without any issues. Typical. And then, just when we didn't have the measuring equipment hooked up, the fault would show up and the charging light would start blinking. That was the biggest challenge. It was that it was very intermittent. So we basically had to drive around with the measuring equipment. When we managed to get it to fail, we could see that there were some error codes that kept showing up. U0120 in the engine control unit lost communication. And then we have P065C, generator mechanical fault. Those are the two error codes that kept coming back. So those are the ones we focused on to begin with. The LIN bus system itself is pretty simple. If we look in Autodata, we can see that we have the generator at the bottom, and then there's a direct LIN bus connection up to the engine control unit. So there are only these components on the LIN network, a master, which is the engine control unit, and a slave, which is the generator. So it's a relatively simple LIN bus. There aren't that many connections, and not that many components in between that could cause interference. Of course, we start by doing all the basic checks, so we've checked the voltage drop on the positive and ground sides, and the voltage drop on the ground over to the engine. We've checked the LIN bus wire, and the pin grip in the LIN bus wire. We also checked the LIN bus wire up at the engine control unit, so all the basics have been checked. Since the error code on the alternator referred to a mechanical fault, we've of course also been very thorough in checking the belt drive. There's no tensioner on this one. It's a stretch belt, and we've checked it. There's nothing wrong with it. We've checked the vulcanization on the counter pulley. We've marked it with color, and that's intact as well. So there are no mechanical faults with the alternator. When the car arrived here at ElectroPartner, it came with a brand new aftermarket alternator. We did this measurement, where at the top we have the battery voltage in red. We have our LIN bus to the alternator, which is blue, and then this gray one here, that's the serial decoding of the LIN bus signal. And the green one shows the charging current. When it finally made the error in the workshop while we had the measuring equipment on, we got this measurement. And if you go in and look at the measurement, you can see the charging current rises, and then it drops sharply. And that's a pattern that repeats itself throughout this entire measurement. And if you look at it every time it drops, we have these red markings. And what we see here is the serial decoding of this LIN bus signal. So if we zoom in on the serial decoding, we can see that where it turns red, the protocols are a bit shorter than where it isn't red. If we zoom in a bit further, we now know that 11 is the slave. So that means it's the generator. Here, it has a protocol of this length when there are no errors. And when there are errors on the generator, over here, the protocol is significantly shorter, and that's why it's red. For your information, this one here is called E9. That's the master, which means it's the motor control unit. For comparison, let's try to look at this image. It's the same LIN bus signal, but it's right here where it turns red. That's when we disconnect the plug from the generator. If we zoom in, we can see it again. We have number E9, that's the master, and 11 is the slave. Here we have a slave before we disconnect the plug, and here is the slave after we disconnect the plug. So based on these measurements, we had to conclude that the generator, even though it was new, had a fault. So we decided to replace the generator based on these measurements. After we replaced the generator, we got this measurement below. If we look at it, we no longer have any red markings on the serial decoding. So now we have a completely perfect LIN bus signal. But despite that, we still have a problem where it starts charging and then drops. It charges, and then the current drops again. The day after, we measured this on the generator, and here we can see that there are 2 dropouts, but nowhere near as many dropouts as there were in the previous measurement. So that shows a bit about how the fault keeps changing all the time, which makes it difficult to measure. So just to sum up, we now know it's not the generator. It has been replaced several times. We have a flawless LIN bus signal. We also know that it's not the motor control unit, and we also know that it's not the battery. So what we're thinking right now is, could there be a failsafe feature built into this LIN bus control generator that makes it stop charging the way it does when it fails? Failsafe could be due to high temperature. It could be over voltage, under voltage, or a mechanical fault. And those are the thoughts we have at this point. So we can definitely understand that this has been a challenge for the workshop that originally had it. To make sure there weren't any problems with the generator overheating, we measured it with an infrared thermometer, and we were lucky enough to measure it right when the fault was happening. And when we had problems with the charging current, the temperature was only 26 degrees, so we could conclude that it's definitely not overheating that's deactivating the charging current on the generator. So now we know that the temperature is fine. There are no mechanical faults. So there were just 2 last things we wanted to check: over voltage and under voltage, and one thing we noticed when we looked at the charging voltage was that there could be some spikes. If we try to look at the red one here, you can see there are occasional spikes like this on the 12-volt side. And if we zoom out a bit, then you can really see them. And then, as a mechanic, you start to wonder, is it too much or is it too little? But in any case, it made us pay close attention to this. Could this be the reason why the alternator stops charging? We brought our Texa with us and took a drive to see if we could spot any errors in the parameter list. One thing we noticed during the measurement was that it could detect a misfire on cylinder 4. Here you can see that it has a misfire, and in just a moment, 2 misfires. But the strange thing was that it reset itself a few seconds later and showed 0 again. So it really required us to stand and watch these parameters for a long time in order to see that there was occasionally a small misfire on cylinder 4. So even though the system could count 2 misfires, there still aren't any error codes for combustion misfires, and there haven't been at any point during this process. Another thing we noticed was that when we had the PICO connected while driving, there was more noise on the charging voltage than when we were just parked in the workshop. Up here at the top, we can see that when it's idling in the workshop, we have this noise. But the moment we take the car out for a drive, there is significantly more noise on the 12-volt line. And when you look back at the process, things suddenly start to make sense. So, noise on the 12-volt line combined with some minor misfires, though not enough to trigger a fault code. Of course, this raises suspicion that ignition noise might be the cause of the charging problems, so that's what we're going to try to measure now. The car is idling. We've measured the secondary image, and it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you just attach one of these probes to the ignition wire, and this car has a double coil. And when we then measure the secondary ignition image, we can see here, cylinder 4 is shown here. It has a high induction. It's all the way up at 97.5 kilovolts. Cylinder 3, here it is. It has an induction of 14 kilovolts. And finally, we have cylinder 2, and it's all the way down at 5 kilovolts. So we can see that we still have our charging voltage here at 12 volts, and we can clearly see that there are some inductions that match up a bit with cylinder 4. But that's despite the fact that the engine is running flawlessly and it has no misfires. Even though the engine seems to be running fine, every now and then you can actually hear that it has some minor misfires. But it's not enough for it to trigger any fault codes for misfires. So right now, we've hooked up the Texa tester, and we're looking at the number of misfires on each cylinder. And just for fun, we're going to try removing a spark plug wire to see what it actually takes before it sets a fault code for misfires. Now cylinder 1 is disconnected, and we're looking at the tester's data here. It hasn't registered anything. That's pretty wild. Isn't that strange? That can't be right, can it? What's missing, Marius? So now the car is running on 3 cylinders. We've disconnected cylinder 1. It's not setting a misfire parameter. And if you look at the error codes, there's also no active error code for misfire. So it's actually a strange engine management system that doesn't store it as an error code. We could observe a big difference in ignition voltage between the cylinders. We could also see that there's some kind of connection with the ignition voltage. It goes up, and we can see it in the 12-volt circuit. So we strongly suspect that the charging problem might be caused by too much or too high ignition noise. So we should try removing the spark plugs and ignition coils to see if we can spot any visual faults. We took out the spark plugs and looked at them. There aren't really any obvious visual signs on them. So we took off the spark plugs and ignition coil, and as you probably guessed, there was a fault here, and we didn't need to look any further than this. So we can already see what the problem is. But that's always how it is with troubleshooting like this. It's easy to be wise after the fact, but there really wasn't anything at all that indicated a misfire. Nothing like that at all when the car came in complaining about charging problems. We've now put on a new ignition coil, and we've driven it a bit to make sure that was the issue. And that was it. We can also see that another symptom we've noticed has changed a bit. When the car came in and had the problem with the alternator, we were surprised that it was running the cooling fan a lot. I mean the ventilator. It was being activated all the time. It was as if the engine was very hot all the time. So it could very well have something to do with the fact that it had these misfires, causing the catalytic converter to get very hot. We can also see from earlier hotline cases that there are workshops asking why the cooling fan is running all the time on these cars. It could be because there might be a small misfire that's constantly heating up the catalytic converter. Just to be thorough, we took a measurement before and after the repair. Here we can again see the charging voltage at the top. Current and LIN bus. So try to notice all the noise here on the 12-volt line before the repair, and then after the repair with the new ignition coil. The case started when a workshop asked for help through Electro Partners hotline. The workshop had spent over a week troubleshooting, replaced several parts, and had sent us some good measurements from the PICO. But even so, we still couldn't figure out what it was, so we decided to bring it over to us here at Electro Partner to get to the bottom of it, because we also love troubleshooting, especially on LIN bus. The fault wasn't what we initially thought it was. We had thought it was the wrong type of alternator, which we could see through serial decoding. But that wasn't the case. It was the ignition coil, so it was an interesting fault, and of course we've made a bulletin about it, which will be included in the DDTSB. I hope you got something out of watching this video, and if you did, remember to give it a like, and we'd love to make more videos like this. And also share in the comments if you've ever had a strange fault because of ignition noise. Thanks for watching.